Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready to really get into it with some forensic pathology? Today we're tackling fire deaths and carbon monoxide poisoning, going beyond the headlines and, really digging into the
Yeah,
science.
we're taking a deep dive, literally, into two of the leading textbooks in the field, forensic pathology and Knight's forensic pathology. And we'll help you sift through all the technical stuff to get to the good stuff.
And trust me, there's a lot of good stuff to unpack here. It's pretty alarming when you consider the numbers, something like 4,000 fire deaths in the U.S. each year, and get this 90% of them occur in
It
homes.
really makes you think twice about fire safety, huh? And it's often the things we overlook, the everyday hazards that turn out to be the most dangerous, faulty wiring, space heaters that haven't been serviced, even a stray cigarette butt.
They say it's the little things, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, those little things can have devastating consequences. And tragically, it's often the most vulnerable among us, the elderly and young children, who are at the highest risk.
Absolutely. Those age groups often need a little extra help reacting quickly or fully understanding the danger, especially when it comes to things like clothing catching fire.
It's a tough reality, but it highlights just how crucial fire safety is, no matter who you are or where you live. Now, the textbooks get into the specifics of burn categories, and they break it down into 6 distinct types, each with its own, I guess you could say, calling card.
We're talking flame burns, contact burns, the often overlooked radiant heat burns, and of course, scalding chemical burns, even those rare microwave burns. Each one tells a story, and it's the forensic pathologist's job to piece that story together.
It's like they're detectives, but instead of looking for clues at a crime scene, they're looking for them on the body itself. So let's start with, I guess, the most obvious one, flame burns. Direct contact with flames, scorching, charring, pretty straightforward. But then there's this subcategory, flash burns, that always makes me think of those big budget action movies.
It's all about the speed and intensity of the heat. Imagine holding your hand over a candle flame versus, say, having a sudden burst of ignited gas engulf your skin. That's the difference between a regular flame burn and a flash burn.
And I'm guessing those movie scenes cut away quickly for a reason because, flash burns can be pretty gruesome.
Yeah, they can be quite severe, but because that initial burst is so quick, they often result in partial thickness burns, like those painful second-degree burns with blisters
Yeah.
and a telltale sign, singed hair.
It's amazing how those little details can speak volumes to a trained eye. Speaking of speed, contact burns are another category that proves just how quickly heat can become dangerous.
We're talking about seemingly simple things, touching a hot stove, grabbing a curling iron, even brushing up against a hot car engine on a summer day. You'd be surprised how little time it takes to cause serious damage.
I'm all too familiar with those accidental stovetop touches. Ouch.
Right. And think about this. At just 70 degrees C, which is about 158 degrees AFR, irreversible damage to the skin can occur in less than a second.
That's what, faster than you can say, ouch?
Pretty much. And it highlights just how vulnerable our skin is to extreme temperatures and how quickly those injuries can occur.
Okay, so we've covered burns from direct contact, but then there's radiant heat, which is kind of a silent culprit, right? It doesn't require any touching at all. It's the heat waves themselves, like those radiating from a bonfire or a house fire, that do the damage.
And it can be incredibly deceptive. You might not feel it right away, but those heat waves are like little ninjas silently inflicting damage beneath the surface.
And the textbooks use a rather striking analogy. They say that in some cases, the skin of a victim of radiant heat burns can resemble and I apologize in advance for the visual, a well-done turkey.
Yeah, not the most appetizing image, is it?
Yeah.
But it gets the point across, even without direct contact, radiant heat can be just as devastating as those other types of burns we've discussed. And it's not just about the temperature either.
There are other factors at play.
Absolutely. The duration of exposure, how long that heat is bombarding the skin, and whether there was any clothing acting as a barrier, those things all play a role in determining the severity. It's a complex interplay of factors.
Speaking of layers, we can't forget about scalding burns, those caused by hot liquids, usually water. And like with radiant heat, clothing can be a bit of a double-edged sword in these cases, right?
Exactly. Clothing can offer some initial protection, but if that fabric gets soaked with, say, boiling water, it traps that heat against the skin, potentially making the burn even worse.
It's a scary thought, your own clothes working against you in a fire.
And it's a good reminder to be mindful of what we're wearing, especially around potential fire hazards. But even something as simple as a spilled cup of coffee can have serious consequences depending on the temperature. It all comes back to those factors we talked about. temperature, duration of contact, and what's coming into contact with the skin.
It's fascinating, really, how each type of burn has its own unique set of characteristics, and how those details can help forensic pathologists paint a clearer picture of what happened. Okay, so we've got a handle on the different ways burns can happen, but how do forensic pathologists actually assess the severity? It can't be as simple as like bad burn, worst burn, right?
You'd think so,
You're
but
right.
they actually use this system of degrees, kind of like in school, to categorize how deep and how bad a burn is. First degree, second degree, all the way to fourth degree.
So the higher the degree, the worse the burn.
You got it. A first-degree burn. That's like your typical sunburn, painful, red, maybe a little swollen, but the damage is, pretty superficial. Second-degree burns, though, that's when you start seeing those nasty blisters, and that tells you the damage goes deeper.
So blisters are a sure sign that things are getting serious.
Exactly. And it's not just about whether there are blisters or not, but also what type they are, how much of the skin is affected, that kind of thing. Now, third-degree burns, those are the ones that really make you cringe. We're talking full thickness damage all the way through the layers of skin.
Those are the images that often come to mind when you hear about severe burns.
And then you have those rare fourth-degree burns, the ones that go beyond even the skin, affecting muscles, tendons, even bone. It's a grim picture for sure.
It's incredible how the body responds to that kind of trauma. But how do they even begin to determine if a burn, especially a severe one, happened before or after death? That seems incredibly difficult to figure out.
Oh, it's one of the trickiest parts of investigating fire deaths. Sometimes a visual exam just doesn't cut it.
You'd think that, like, with all the technology we have today, they could just, I don't know, look at the tissue under a microscope and tell, right?
You'd hope so, right?
Yeah.
But even microscopic analysis has its limits. It can tell us if the victim lived long enough for their body to start fighting back, to mount an inflammatory response. But here's the thing. If there's no sign of that response, it doesn't automatically mean the burn happened after they died.
So it's not a foolproof method.
Not always. The textbooks mention cases from the Vietnam War where some burned victims showed barely any inflammation around their injuries, even though they lived for a while after.
Really?
Yeah, turned out the intense heat messed up their blood vessels so badly that the inflammatory cells couldn't even reach the area. Crazy, right?
So even at a microscopic level, it's not always a clear-cut answer.
It's a puzzle, and sometimes the pieces don't fit together perfectly. They have to consider everything. What the burn looks like, if there's soot present, the condition of the internal organs. It's like putting together a story from the clues left behind.
Speaking of clues, we talked about clothing being a double-edged sword when it comes to fires. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure, think about it this way. Clothing can provide a layer of protection, especially during those first crucial seconds when someone's exposed to flames or, intense heat. But, and this is a big but, if that clothing catches fire, well, then it's like adding fuel to the fire, literally. It sticks to the skin, and that can make the burn way worse.
It's like your clothes turning against you in the worst way possible.
That's a tragic reality. And it's not just about whether the clothing ignites, but also the type of fabric. Loose-fitting garments, anything made from synthetic materials, those tend to be the worst offenders.
That's a good reminder to, be mindful of what you're wearing, especially around any potential fire hazards. But even if a victim is found without any significant burns, there's still the risk of smoke inhalation, right? And from what I've read, it's not just the heat. There's a lot more to it than that.
You're right, smoke inhalation is a whole other beast. It's not just about the soot or the heat itself, though those are definitely factors. The real silent killer in these cases is often carbon monoxide, or CO.
Carbon monoxide, the invisible odorless gas they always warn you about with car exhaust and faulty furnaces, it's scary stuff.
And it's sneaky. And even though there's that, cherry red coloration that we often hear about with CO poisoning, you might see it in the skin, the muscles, even the blood, it's not a surefire sign.
Wait, what? So someone could have that cherry red look and it's not from carbon monoxide poisoning?
It happens. Cyanide poisoning can cause a very similar appearance, and believe it or not, so can prolonged exposure to cold temperatures, especially when it comes to livor mortis.
Livor mortis.
Yeah, those patterns of discoloration you see on the skin after death, they can be pretty telling, but they can also be misleading.
So how do forensic pathologists know for sure if carbon monoxide is the culprit?
That's where blood analysis comes in. They can actually measure the levels of CO in the blood, and it can stay pretty stable, even in bodies that are, well, not the best shape. But here's where it gets really interesting. The textbooks point out that carbon monoxide levels in fire deaths are often lower than what you'd see in those classic exhaust fume deaths.
Lower. You'd think being caught in a fire would lead to higher levels than sitting in a car.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But in exhaust fume deaths, the average CO saturation in the blood is around 79%. In fire deaths, it's closer to 57%.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference. Why is that?
It's a bit of a mystery, but it probably has to do with the intensity and duration of exposure. In a fire, you've got so many variables at play: how hot the fire is, what's burning, how long the person was exposed, plus their age, health, if they had any underlying conditions. That all factors in.
So it's not just about the CO itself, but also how vulnerable the individual was in the first place.
Exactly. And while CO tends to grab all the headlines, it's not the only potentially deadly thing in smoke. Oxygen deprivation can also play a role, and then you have cyanide, especially with all the synthetic materials we have these days. And don't forget about free radicals.
Free radicals, those sound kind of intense.
They are, and they're still not fully understood, but we know they're produced during combustion and can really mess things up at the cellular level.
So it's not as simple as CO in death. There's this whole cascade of things happening inside the body.
Absolutely. Now, with oxygen deprivation, that can definitely be a factor, especially in a really intense fire. But some experts argue that if the oxygen levels were low enough to kill someone quickly, the fire itself would likely die out too.
That makes sense. What about cyanide? Isn't that like super deadly?
It is, but the textbooks mention that its role in fire deaths might be a bit overblown. There were some early studies that found really high cyanide levels in fire victims, but there are some questions about how accurate those measurements were.
So it's more nuanced than just saying cyanide is always a major factor in fire deaths.
Exactly. And as for those free radicals we talked about, there's still a bit of a mystery, but there's some evidence that they might play a role in damaging the lungs after smoke inhalation. It's definitely an area where more research is needed.
It's amazing how much we still don't know about something like smoke inhalation. It seems so straightforward, but it's incredibly complex.
That's what makes forensic pathology so fascinating, right? There's always more to learn, more to uncover.
Speaking of uncovering, let's talk about the challenges of identifying a body that's been severely burned. I mean, fingerprints are out of the question, right?
You're right, fingerprints are usually a no-go in these cases. Imagine a scene where everything's been damaged by fire. Personal belongings are ash, faces are unrecognizable. It's like trying to identify a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
So what do they do? How do they even begin to figure out who the victim is?
Well, that's where dental records become incredibly important. Teeth are surprisingly durable. They're like little time capsules, even in fire.
Makes sense. I mean, we always hear about how important it is to go to the dentist regularly.
It's true. And in these cases, those regular checkups can be a lifesaver, or at least a life identifier. They can compare the dental records from the deceased dentist with any x-rays or dental work that survived the fire.
It's like in those crime dramas where they bring in the forensic dentist to identify a John or Jane Doe.
Exactly. And any antemortem x-rays, chest x-rays, old fracture x-rays, anything like that can be super helpful too. They're like a roadmap pointing out any unique skeletal features, old injuries, even things like calcified blood vessels or surgical implants that can help make a positive ID.
It's incredible how the smallest detail can be so crucial in these investigations.
Absolutely. And when traditional methods fail, there's always DNA analysis, which has revolutionized forensic science, especially when you're dealing with, well, highly fragmented remains. DNA can be the gold standard.
It's amazing how far forensic technology has come. But it's not just about high-tech tools, is it? Even studying the process of cremation can provide valuable insights, right?
You're right. Even something like cremation, which is a controlled burn in a very specific environment, can teach us a lot about how the body responds to fire.
So by understanding that controlled burn, they can better interpret what they're seeing at a fire scene.
Exactly. It helps them make sense of the timeline, estimate how long a body might have been exposed to the flames, even potentially figure out which injuries happened before death versus after. It's about using every tool at their disposal to piece together what happened.
That's fascinating how even something like cremation can offer valuable clues in these investigations.
Every piece of information helps, and sometimes the most unexpected sources can lead to the biggest breakthroughs.
Speaking of unexpected, we've talked a lot about accidents, but what about those cases where the fire is no accident, where it's deliberately set, either as an act of arson or even, well, something more sinister?
You're right, not all fires are accidental. Some are deliberately set, and those cases bring a whole other level of complexity to the table.
And I imagine those darker intentions often leave behind a lot more than just physical clues, right?
Absolutely. When arson is involved, the investigation shifts. It's not just about understanding how the victim died, but also about uncovering the motive. Was it revenge, insurance fraud, maybe even an attempt to cover up another crime altogether?
It's like adding a whole other layer to that puzzle we talked about earlier, trying to piece together not just the how, but also the why.
It's a whole other level of detective work, and it requires a keen eye, not just for the physical evidence, but also for the psychological aspects of the crime. People who set fires often leave behind telltale signs, not just in the physical world, but in their behavior, their relationships, their pasts.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is. The physical evidence, the psychology, the history. It's like a giant web.
And it's the forensic pathologist's job to untangle that web, thread by thread, until the truth is revealed.
It's a daunting task, but a crucial one.
Well, on that note, let's take a break from the heavy stuff for a moment and circle back to those other types of burns we briefly touched on earlier. Scalding, chemical, and those rare microwave burns. Those must present their own unique challenges.
Oh, definitely. Each type of burn has its own quirks, its own way of interacting with the body.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to analyzing these injuries.
Not at all. Take scalding burns, for instance. They're caused by hot liquids, usually water, coming into contact with the skin, and they can range from those minor first-degree burns to, well, pretty horrific third-degree burns.
I imagine it all depends on the temperature of the liquid and how long it was in contact with the skin.
Exactly. A splash of hot coffee is one thing, but a full-on immersion in boiling water, that's a whole other ballgame. And those patterns, the way the burn looks on the skin, those can tell you a lot about what happened, right?
Absolutely. A splash pattern versus an immersion burn, those tell very different stories. And unfortunately, those patterns can sometimes be a red flag for abuse, especially when it comes to children or vulnerable adults.
That's heartbreaking to think about, but it's an important aspect of this work, isn't it? Recognizing those patterns and being able to speak for those who can't speak for themselves.
It's a responsibility that forensic pathologists take very seriously. They're not just looking at bodies, they're looking for answers, for justice.
Now, what about chemical burns? Those always sound particularly nasty.
They can be, depending on the chemical we're talking about. Bleach, drain cleaner, those are the usual suspects, but even things like gasoline or cement can cause serious burns.
Cement, really?
Yeah, it's not something people usually think about, but it can cause some nasty chemical burns if it's not handled properly. And here's where the chemistry gets interesting. Acids. Acids and alkalis. Those are the two main categories of chemical agents, and they interact with the skin in very different ways.
So a burn from, say, battery acid would look different from a burn caused by, I don't know, drain cleaner.
You got it. Acids tend to cause what we call coagulation necrosis, which basically means the proteins in the skin clump together, creating a more superficial burn. Alkalis, on the other hand, they cause something called liquefaction necrosis.
Liquefaction, that sounds intense.
It is. Alkalis break down the tissue, turning it into this, gel-like substance, which can lead to much deeper, more severe burns that are really difficult to treat.
So even figuring out what type of chemical caused the burn is a crucial part of the investigation.
Absolutely. It all adds to the puzzle.
Speaking of puzzles, what about those rare microwave burns? Those seem like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
They're definitely not common, but they do happen, and they highlight how differently microwaves interact with the human body compared to, like, a stovetop or an open flame.
So it's not about the microwave itself being hot, but rather the way the waves, the energy, interacts with the body.
Exactly. Microwaves work by making water molecules vibrate super fast, which generates heat from the inside out. And because different parts of the body have different amounts of water, you can get some really unusual burn patterns.
So the location and pattern of the burn can actually tell you something about how it happened.
Precisely. It's all about reading those subtle clues, connecting the dots to figure out what happened.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to analyzing these injuries.
Not at all. Take scalding burns, for instance. They're caused by hot liquids, usually water, coming into contact with the skin. And they can range from, those minor first-degree burns to, well, honestly, pretty horrific third-degree burns.
I imagine it all depends on, the temperature of the liquid and how long it was actually touching the skin.
Exactly. A splash of hot coffee is one thing, but a full-on immersion in boiling water, that's a whole other ballgame.
And those patterns, the way the burn actually looks on the skin, I mean, Those can tell you a lot about what happened. Yeah.
Absolutely. A splash pattern versus an immersion burn, those tell very different stories. And, sadly, those patterns can sometimes be a red flag for abuse, especially when we're talking about children or, vulnerable adults.
That's heartbreaking to think about, but it's a really important aspect of this work, isn't it? Recognizing those patterns and being able to speak for those who can't speak for themselves.
It's a responsibility that forensic pathologists, they take very seriously. They're not just looking at bodies. They're looking for answers, for justice.
Now, what about chemical burns? Those always sound, I don't know, particularly nasty to me.
They can be, yeah, depending on the chemical.
Yeah.
Bleach, drain cleaner, those are the usual suspects.
Yeah.
But, even things like gasoline or cement can cause serious burns.
Cement.
Yeah, it's not something people usually think about, but it can cause some pretty bad chemical burns, especially if it's not handled properly.
And here's where the chemistry gets, well, kind of interesting. Acids and alkalis. Those are the two main categories of chemical agents. And they interact with the skin in very different ways.
So a burn from, say, battery acid would look different from a burn caused by, I don't know, like drain cleaner.
You got it. Acids tend to cause what we call coagulation necrosis. Basically, the proteins in the skin kind of clump together, which creates a more superficial burn. Alkalis, though, they cause something called liquefaction necrosis.
Liquefaction, that sounds kind of intense.
It is. Alkalis, they basically break down the tissue, turning it into this gel-like substance, and that can lead to much deeper, more severe burns that are, well, they're really difficult to treat. So even just figuring out what type of chemical caused the burn is a crucial part of the investigation.
Absolutely. It all adds to the puzzle, right?
Speaking of puzzles, what about those rare microwave burns? Those seem, I don't know, like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
They're definitely not common, but they do happen. And they really highlight how differently microwaves interact with the human body compared to like a stovetop or an open flame.
So it's not about the microwave itself being hot, but rather the way the waves, the energy, I guess, interacts with the body.
Exactly. Microwaves work by making water molecules vibrate really, really fast, which generates heat from the inside out. And because different parts of the body have different amounts of water, you can get some really unusual burn patterns.
So the location and the pattern of the burn can actually tell you something about how it happened.
Precisely. It's all about reading those subtle clues,
Yeah.
connecting the dots to figure out what happened. And that's what forensic pathologists do. They take all these pieces, the burns, the evidence at the scene, the medical history, everything, and they use that to tell the story of what happened, to give a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves.
That's powerful and a little bit haunting when you think about it. It's a reminder that even in death, there are stories to be told, lessons to be learned, and a search for truth that continues.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from those subtle differences in burn patterns to the silent killer that is carbon monoxide.
It's been quite a deep dive. It has. And to our listeners, if this has piqued your interest, don't stop here. Keep exploring. Delve deeper into the world of forensic science, learn about the pioneers in this field, read those fascinating and sometimes gruesome case studies.
It's a fascinating field, that's for sure. And it reminds us that every burn, every scar, it tells a story. It's up to us to listen.
Well said. That's it for this week's deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.